Welcome, dear viewers. If you dare to venture into the unknown, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales and terrifying content that will haunt your dreams. Prologue. Ashbury had always felt wrong. Nestled in the remote woods of New England, the town seemed to exist outside of time, an eerie place where the trees loomed tall and dense, swallowing the roads and blanketing the town in shadows. The air was always thick, heavy with something you couldn't quite name, and the fog rolled in every evening, seeping into the cracks of the old houses. But it wasn't just the weather or the isolation. Something darker had always clung to Ashbury, something that people whispered about but didn't dare say aloud. The town had secrets buried deep in its roots, stories of disappearances, strange sightings, and shadows that moved when no one was watching. And at the center of it all was Whittaker House, standing like a decaying titan on the outskirts, overlooking the town with its windows like dark, unblinking eyes. No one had lived in Whittaker House for decades, not since the family that built it vanished without a trace. But the house never forgot. And for those who listened carefully enough, it whispered. And now, after years of silence, it was whispering again. Chapter 1, The Return. Jeremy Cartwright swore he'd never return to Ashbury. He'd escaped the town the day he turned 18, fleeing from the ghosts of his past, both literal and metaphorical. But when the phone call came, he had no choice. His father, Tom Cartwright, had been found dead, face down in the river that wound through the woods outside of town. They said it was an accident. But Jeremy knew better. His father had been many things, an alcoholic, a bitter man broken by life, but he wasn't careless. His death had been no accident. Driving into Ashbury felt like slipping into a nightmare he thought he'd left behind. The narrow road twisted through the forest, the trees pressing in on either side, and as Jeremy approached, the town seemed to emerge from the fog like a mirage. It hadn't changed. The buildings were still worn and grey, the streets cracked and empty, and above it all, Whittaker House loomed, more decrepit than ever, its silhouette dark against the overcast sky. As Jeremy passed the rusted gate of the house, he felt it, the same cold, creeping dread that had always made him avoid the place as a kid. He glanced at the windows, expecting to see nothing. But something flickered in the corner of his eye, a shadow shifting behind the cracked glass. He blinked, but the shadow was gone. Chapter 2, Old Wounds. Jeremy's father's house was as dilapidated as he'd expected. The porch sagged under his weight as he climbed the steps, and the front door creaked loudly when he pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of mildew, rot, and old whiskey. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick and stale. It was like stepping into a tomb. The living room was still frozen in time. His father's old armchair sat in the corner, the cushion dented from years of use, a bottle of whiskey still sitting on the side table. Jeremy had spent his childhood hiding from his father's rages, cowering in his bedroom as Tom Cartwright drank himself into a fury. Coming back now, it felt like none of it had ever ended. As he moved through the house, Jeremy found a piece of paper lying on the kitchen table, the edges yellowed and brittle. His father's jagged handwriting filled the page, and as Jeremy read the words, his stomach twisted. It's back. It's in the house again. God help me, it's watching. Jeremy stared at the note, his heart pounding. His father had never believed in the supernatural, had always scoffed at the idea of ghosts. But this note was filled with fear, with desperation. What had he seen? And why did it seem so familiar? Chapter 3, The Cult of the Whisperer. The next morning, Jeremy headed into town. He needed answers, and he knew where to start. The Ashbury Diner was the heart of town gossip, and if anyone knew what had been going on with his father in the months before his death, it would be the regulars. The bell above the door jingled as Jeremy stepped inside, and all conversation stopped. The locals, weathered and silent, stared at him with suspicion and something else, fear. He recognized a few faces, but most of them had aged beyond recognition. Jeremy Cartwright, a voice said from the corner. Sheriff Hank Lawson, his father's old friend, sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. Didn't think I'd see you back here. Didn't plan on coming back, Jeremy muttered, sliding onto the stool next to him. What happened to my father? The sheriff glanced around, then leaned in closer. Your father was mixed up in something, Jeremy. Something dark. He started talking about the house a few months ago, said it was waking up. Said it was watching him, whispering to him. Jeremy frowned. Whittaker House? Lawson nodded. He wasn't the only one, either. People have been seeing things, strange things. Shadows moving in the woods. Lights in the windows of that old place. And then there's the cult. Jeremy froze. Cult? They call themselves the Children of the Whisperer, Lawson said, lowering his voice even further. They've been around for generations, worshipping something they claim lies in Whittaker House. They're the ones who started all those rumors years ago, about the house being cursed. Your father was convinced they were watching him. Following him. Chapter 4, The Whisperer's Children. The more Jeremy dug into the mystery of his father's death, the more he began to unravel the dark history of Ashbury, and the cult that had haunted the town for centuries. The Children of the Whisperer had been around since the days of Elias Whittaker, the original owner of Whittaker House. Whittaker had been a wealthy landowner with a reputation for dabbling in the occult. He gathered a group of followers, and together, they conducted rituals meant to summon a dark, ancient entity, a being they called the Whisperer. According to legend, Whittaker succeeded in summoning the entity, but it had turned on him, consuming him and his family. The house had been abandoned ever since, but the cult remained, continuing their rituals in secret, waiting for the day when the Whisperer would return and reward them for their devotion. Jeremy didn't want to believe it. It sounded insane, like some half-baked conspiracy theory. But the more he investigated, the more he began to notice the signs. The strange symbols carved into trees near Whittaker House. The whispers that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The cold, oppressive presence that lingered around the house, as if the air itself was alive. And then there were the people. He started seeing them, lurking in the shadows, men and women in dark, hooded robes, watching him from a distance, disappearing before he could confront them. It was as if the whole town was infected with this madness, and now it was coming for him. Chapter 5, The Others Drawn In. As Jeremy's paranoia grew, so did the pull of Whittaker House. It wasn't just him, others had been drawn to the house, too, each of them connected to the cult and the darkness that surrounded the mansion. Sarah Blake, a historian researching New England's occult history, had stumbled upon records of the Whittaker family's disappearance and the rituals they had performed. The deeper she dug, the more she became obsessed with the idea that something supernatural was tied to the house. She came to Ashbury, unable to resist the pull of the dark history she was uncovering. Father Daniel Mallory, a priest on the edge of a breakdown, had come to Ashbury after hearing rumors of demonic activity. He had lost his faith years ago, but something about the whispers surrounding Whittaker House intrigued him. He believed that if he could banish the evil from the town, he might find redemption. Emily Thompson, a local woman whose son had disappeared near Whittaker House, had spent years searching for answers. She had always believed the house was responsible for her son's disappearance, but now, with the cult becoming more active, she felt she was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. One by one, they arrived in Ashbury, each of them drawn to the house by forces they couldn't fully understand. And Whittaker House welcomed them with open arms. Chapter 6, Into the Darkness. Together, Jeremy, Sarah, Father Mallory, and Emily formed an uneasy alliance. They knew the only way to stop whatever was happening in Ashbury was to confront the source, Whittaker House. Armed with what little knowledge they had of the cult and its rituals, they made their way to the mansion. The house stood silent and imposing as they approached, its windows dark and its walls covered in ivy and moss. The air around it was colder, thicker, as if the very atmosphere was different here. The whispers started the moment they crossed the threshold, faint at first, but growing louder as they ventured deeper inside. The house was a labyrinth of decaying rooms and crumbling hallways, but the deeper they went, the more they began to see the signs of the cult. Symbols carved into the walls, remnants of old rituals, and worst of all, the bones, piles of them, hidden in the corners, the remains of those who had disappeared over the years. In the basement, they found the heart of the cult's activities. An altar sat in the center of the room, surrounded by candles that burned with a strange, flickering light. The walls were covered in strange writings, inscriptions that Sarah recognized as part of an ancient ritual meant to summon the Whisperer. And then they saw it, the Whisperer's book, a tome bound in human skin, lying on the altar. The book contained the secrets of the cult, the instructions for summoning the entity that haunted Whittaker House. But as they approached, the shadows in the room began to move. Chapter 7, The Whisperer Revealed. Whittaker House wasn't just haunted, it was alive, a vessel for the ancient entity known as the Whisperer. The shadows that moved within the house were not spirits, but extensions of the Whisperer itself, feeding on the fear and despair of those who entered. As they opened the book, the house began to shift around them. The walls groaned, the floor buckled, and the shadows coalesced into something terrible, an amorphous, writhing mass of darkness, filled with the faces of the dead. The Whisperer had been waiting for them, feeding on the cult's rituals, growing stronger with each passing year. Now, it was ready to emerge from the house and spread its influence beyond Ashbury. The cult members appeared, surrounding them in a circle, chanting in a language that none of them could understand. The room filled with a terrible, oppressive energy, and the Whisperer grew larger, its form shifting, twisting into something that defied reality. The group fought back, but the Whisperer was too powerful, its presence overwhelming. It whispered their deepest fears into their minds, breaking them down one by one, turning their own thoughts against them. Chapter 8, The Sacrifice. As the Whisperer consumed their strength, Jeremy realized that there was only one way to stop it. The cult had been using sacrifices to feed the entity, and the only way to break its hold was to give it what it wanted, but on their terms. Father Mallory, desperate to find redemption, volunteered to offer himself as the final sacrifice. He stepped forward, speaking the ancient words from the Whisperer's book, binding the entity to the house once again. The shadows writhed, screaming as they were pulled back into the walls, and the house groaned as if in pain. But the ritual required more than one soul. Emily, consumed by grief and driven by the desire to see her son again, stepped forward to join Father Mallory. Together, they completed the ritual, sealing the Whisperer within Whittaker House once more. The cult scattered, their power broken, and the house fell silent. But Jeremy knew that the Whisperer was still there, waiting in the shadows. Waiting for the next sacrifice. Epilogue. Jeremy left Ashbury for the last time, but the memories of what happened in Whittaker House followed him. The town had returned to its quiet, forgotten state, and the cult had dissolved, but the darkness remained. Whittaker House stood empty once more, its windows dark, its walls silent. But somewhere deep inside, the Whisperer waited, biding its time, whispering to those who dared to listen. And Jeremy knew that one day, it would whisper again.